All right, so my name is Luke VanderHart. I work for Cognitect in the US. Thank you so much for having me out here. It's been an amazing conference. I've really enjoyed my time in Finland, so I'm excited to be here. So this talk is about simplicity. It's kind of extending, riffing on some of the ideas that Rich and Stu, some of the other folks at Cognitect, other people in the Clojure community have been talking about for a while. And this talk in particular is really pretty much a retrospective of the past couple years of my programming career. I've had some frustrations with how things have worked out. This pretty much describes how I feel about a lot of code lately. Somebody's trying to do something really simple. It shouldn't be hard, but everything is hard until somebody makes it easy. And then he wants to turn his computer back to sand. But this actually resonates with me a lot. I want to turn my computer to sand almost every day. And this is programming in Clojure. I've done my time in Java, and Clojure is way better. But still feel this way sometimes. So, this is a little bit of an exploration that I've been going through of, why I think things are this way and what we can maybe do to make it a little bit better. So, why are my slides? There we go. So if you're paying attention in the comic on the previous slide, you'll notice that it used the words simple and easy. Now, if you've heard many talks by Clojure programmers, that should immediately start ringing bells in your head. These are very strong buzzwords. In fact, I would go so far as to say that within the Clojure and functional programming community, these have become memes. They're these concepts that have taken up a life of their own. Memes in the Richard Dawkins sense, not in that cat picture sense. And ever since Rich introduced them in his Simple Made Easy talk, they've kind of, at least in my sector, dominated the discussion around what does it mean to be a good Clojure program. These concepts of it should be data, it should be simple, it should be a few parts. So let's real quick go back and talk about those terms just so we make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So simple, according to Rich, in the Hickeyan definition of the word, is one fold, one braid, one role task, one concept dimension. It's singularity as opposed to combining or interleaving of things. It's the opposite of something complex. It's the opposite of something interleaved or of many parts. And simple is a relatively objective measure. You can look at code and you can count how many parts it has and how they're tied together. It's not something that you have to it's not something that's subjective to you. Easy, on the other hand, means something near at hand, something very familiar, something I can start using right away. The opposite of easy is hard, requiring lots of effort. And easy is a relative measure, right? Because something easy, that utterly depends on easy for me. Finnish is a much easier language than English, but not for me, because I already speak English. So, easy is relative, but we like easy too. We like all of them. So, so we can talk about the benefits we get, and there's a whole network of benefits you get from these qualities. Now, simplicity has a pretty impressive benefits network. Simplicity leads directly to testability, understanding, changeability, which, and then there's a second order effect, leads to reliability and debuggability and long-term development speed, right? Because you're not building up work for yourself as you develop, it becomes easier in the future. Whereas easy, the benefits are not so plain. The immediate benefit is short-term development speed, right? That's almost the definition of easy. But easy really doesn't have anything to say about testability. It may make things easier to test, but it may make them harder. It may make your code easier to understand, but it may also make it harder. The quality of easiness really doesn't affect these other qualities that we care about. So, in the Clojure community, we have decided that simple is better than easy for some betterness function. And if you want to stack rank these two concepts, simple is more important than easy. Okay, I buy that. That's historical contexts. These are probably not new ideas to anyone. Simple is more likely to lead to the attributes that we want. So yeah, simplicity is necessary, especially when we're dealing with big, complex systems that do hard things. It's really important that we be simple. But simplicity is not sufficient. And this is a point that I think that I'm going to try to hammer home over the next couple minutes when we think about these concepts. I don't think anyone actually said that simplicity was sufficient. There's other qualities of our code that we want. But I think you can take the concept of simplicity too far when you start prioritizing it above every possible quality. So say, for example, that I'm building a car, right? I want to build a car in my garage, and I'm going to need one of these things, or something similar, to make the car go, right? It's a very important piece. Now, if I'm building the car, I probably want this, as opposed to this, right? Some people want this. Some people want all the individual parts, if they're, fine-tuning a race car from scratch, and that's all they do. But if I'm building a car myself, I really, really want the engine, not everything split out into a million pieces. And yet, this is simpler, according to the, the definition we just discussed. Look at all these complected parts. Every part touches every other part. What's up with that? This is, here they all run together very smoothly, we can do whatever you want with these parts. It's not a perfect analogy. It's the same engine. You can't actually run this till you put it together. But how many people have used a Clojure library that when you started reading the documentation, start reading the APIs, it looked more like this? When you wanted this, you wanted something you could use, and you got something like this that you first had to figure out how to use and put it all together yourself, right? I find that all the time. It's very common in the Clojure world to have this happen. So, small example of that. So this is common wisdom in the Clojure space. Never define global stateful variables. And the reason being that they are a classic example of something that is easy to use, but not something that is necessarily simple. So why don't we want to actually do this? This is fine at the REPL, by the way. I'm talking about in your actual production application, having code that looks like this. Well, what's wrong with this? Well, they complex or unnecessarily intertwine namespaces with runtime application state, right? I've taken what is a code organization structure, and now that same code organization structure holds my state of my application at runtime, active connections, active data. Those two things are connected when they ought not to be. Similarly, it complex compilation with app initialization. Compilation is the process of building my project into bytecode. App initialization is the process of firing everything up and starting it. So, okay, so this is not great. So what do I do instead? Well, here's the common wisdom for that. Create a single object representing an application state, which you can construct explicitly at app initialization time, and pass it around to the rest of your program. Now, maybe you've been programming Clojure so long that that doesn't bother you, but here is what most people hear that, right? Yeah, that sounds hard. And I don't know half those words you just said, right? We were handed a bag of parts in the Clojure language, and then we have to figure out how to best use that ourselves. And of course, there is an answer here, right? What's this? This is a component. We love component. Component solves this problem and makes life better, so that it actually gives us tools to make it relatively easy to manage state in an appropriate way and not bind top-level vars in our program. But, so I was thinking about this, just trying to think about that whole mental process. And that was a microcosm, but there's so many Clojure libraries that follow exactly the same train of thought, right? Well, I could do it this way. That'd be really easy. The correct way is to do it this way. Maybe that's easy, maybe it's not. And then what do we end up with? Well, what is the story there? And is that a story that we can repeat? So I think, talking about stories, I think that's the concept itself. In the case of vars, and back when we gave our really unhelpful advice there, the problem was that we didn't tell a story about how to use that bit of the Clojure language. The code itself had no binding narrative. There was no progression of thought that you can latch your mind onto to follow from one idea to another. And that's precisely, I think, the value of the component library, which solves the issue. The component library itself is a few dozen lines of code. It's not big. So what's the value of that as a library? It's the concept it brings. It tells a story about here's how application state is supposed to work. It's fundamentally about programmers talking to other programmers and telling the same story. So stories are important. There was an excellent essay by Bruce Eckel written a while back, and he tried to figure out what is programming like. And he was like, is it engineering? Well, no, it's not very much like engineering, actually. If you talk to real engineers, how they work is very different from how we work. Is it like science? Well, there's some similarities, but really, the process of science is very different. If you ask your boss, or if your boss asks you, when's the project going to be done, you can't give him the same kind of answer that an engineer would give. You can't give him the same kind of answer that a scientist would give, or an accountant, or any other field. So, what is programming like? And his conclusion is programming is like writing, right? Because it's a creative task that nevertheless accomplishes real useful things. Timelines are, you can tell time, and schedules and estimations a whole other thing, but it still is an individual act of craft and creativity, even though it has objective standards. So writing and programming share a lot of the same concerns. And so, we can think about some of the isomorphisms between code and between stories. Code has functions and data and execution flow and how the system actually works and processes, and stories have aspects too. They have settings, they have casts of characters, they have plots. And a story has to have things to keep it interesting. And as a developer, I actually need these same things. I have to have interest in what I'm doing. Now, in the case of a story or a book, I have to be interested in the topic or entertained by the topic. It has to be worth my time to read. Similarly, for programming, I'm not going to bother to use your library unless it solves a problem for me, right? So there's this element of interest there. There's also an element of clarity, like I have to be able to follow what's going on, or it has to be clear. It has to be written in an intelligible way, and then more importantly, I have to comprehend it. So those are the two sides. Clarity and comprehension are two sides of the same coin. Being clear helps with comprehension. And then something we have when we're developing that you don't really have in writing so much, unless you're in one of those workshops where everyone writes a paragraph of the story and then passes the paper to the next guy, and you end up with something completely incoherent, is collaboration. Software is like a novel written by the 12 people at your company, with the caveat that it actually has to make sense, right? Which it's not easy to do, but everyone has to be on the same page about what's going on. You have to be mentally engaged with each other, with your fellow developers. If you're a library writer or a user of a library, you have to be on the same mental page as the person whose library you wrote. I have to look at Yada and think, yes, I understand why he does it that way. That's why it solves my problem. I'm interested in using that. And then we're on the same page. We're kind of telling the same software story as we write software. But the flip side is, we don't live in the same world necessarily as the people using our code. Libraries, I write a library and I put it out into the wild. I don't know who's going to use it. I don't know what planet they're going to use it on. I don't know what purpose they're going to use it for. I've written a couple small libraries, and I'm always really interested by the stories people tell about what they're using it for. One person's using it, for the American government work, doing nefarious things. Another person is using it to feed puppies in South America. Another guy's using it to do biomedical research to cure cancer. People use your code for all sorts of different things. And those stories are valuable. You can't tell what people are going to want to use your code for. That's not up to you at the time you write a library. Indeed, I don't know what I'm going to want to do with my code next month. On the most mundane level, requirements on an individual project change. So, we have everyone has their own story that they want to tell. And as developers, we all participate in each other's stories, but we don't get to control them. But we do get to make a contribution. So I think what we need to do is think about things in those terms. Think about what is our contribution to the other ways in which this code is going to be used? Trying to think about how to do that. So let's go back and talk about words some more, because I like words a lot. So let's inspect these terms that we've been talking about. So there is some relationship between easy and simple. And when I use the words easy and simple, I am using them in the strictly defined Hickeyan sense we just talked about. Well, Rich had in his talk a slide that looked like this. Now this slide is actually talking about development speed. But it has something interesting. It has a chart that's really easy to latch onto as developers. And if you can read charts at all, And you don't read the axis. All you see is easy and simple, and the lines are strictly opposite. So a lot of people just jump to the assumption that there's a negative connotation, right? Or a strictly negative correlation between ease and simplicity. It's a zero-sum trade-off between one and the other. This is manifestly not true. If you make something harder, that doesn't automatically make it simpler. See, all software ever written, particularly if you've ever worked in Java, making something harder does not make it better. And similarly, if you make something simple, it doesn't have to be harder. In fact, all other things being equal, making something simpler tends to make it easier, in my experience. Breaking down a problem helps people to think about it. It helps to tell the story. So in general, if I was pressed to say, is there a correlation between ease and simplicity, I'd want to make it a positive correlation, right? As you get more ease, you get more simplicity, or as you get more simplicity, you get more ease, and vice versa. Now, it's certainly not a perfect correlation there, because we know it's definitely possible to have ease and not simplicity. But I started casting around for vocabulary to think about these things and describe these things. So I'm going to follow in the footsteps of people much smarter than I am, who apparently know what they're doing, and resurrect a word. So this is, find a word to deal with this. I'm not trying to globally define the meaning of the word, but I think sometimes it's useful just for a mental exercise to try to give names to things so that we can think about concepts. So the word that I came up with is wieldy. Here's how it's defined. This is the formal definition. So the first definition doesn't really apply. That's like you're a very nimble person. That's an obsolete usage. The one that I'm interested in is easily wielded, controlled, or handled. Manageable, handy. Or I'm given to understand that in British English, the second definition is more common, requiring strength, heavy, powerful. But I actually like both of these definitions. I think we can build a good programmer definition of this word and start thinking about our code in terms of it. Something that is manageable, something that is handy, something that is powerful, something that lives at the intersection of easy and simple in a perfect world. And it does very much pertain to developer experience. It's powerful and fun to use. You feel effective as a developer. Feeling effective isn't the most important thing. Being effective is the most important thing. But when I feel effective, chances are I'm also being effective, right? Usually there's a correlation there. If I'm feeling frustrated, that's usually because I'm not being very effective. And it's not an objective measure, no. But it's not purely a subjective measure either. I like to think about it as a relational measure, right? If I'm using code or APIs or libraries that you've designed, how easy that is for me to use is kind of a relational question in some way almost between you and me. Are we on the same page? Are we talking the same language? Am I participating in the story that you're telling? So what are some of the benefits? If we decide we want to do this thing and write wieldy code that's easy to use and also simple, and something that I can really be effective with, but heavyweight, there's a reason this word is used, to refer to weapons. It's because something very important that you need to perform well if you're not going to die. But it has to be something that you can use well. And code, I think, is something, most of us are professional programmers in the room, like something we need to be able to use well. So if we can write wieldy code, it's going to give us more flexibility in our code bases because we can get in there and change things. We're not afraid, we don't hesitate to touch our code. How many of you guys have ever worked at the code base that you get in there and you're like, oh, I got to go open up that and find that and look for that and change that and find that and shit, this is going to take days. The more we feel empowered, the more handy the code feels to us, the less, even just psychological barrier, if only that, the less barrier there's going to be there. Of course, it also has benefits of code base size. Large amounts of code are never wieldy, right? It's impossible to be wieldy with massive, massive amounts of code you have to write. So it also obviously has a clear correlation to development speed. And I would say not particularly at the beginning or the end of a project, just overall, the more handy, the more malleable, the easier it is for me to manipulate my code, the better. And it's also, like I mentioned before, developer morale. It's important that we are excited and happy about the code we're writing because it's impossible to be effective if you hate going to work every day. And then there's also about developer improvement. So how is wieldy code that's simple and or easy, related to developer improvement. So, in some philosophies, and this is perfectly legitimate in the case of philosophies or religions, but there's this concept that to achieve mastery, it's through personal effort and practice. You can have masters who can guide you on the path, but it's up to you to climb the mountain, to put in the work, to ascend to the next level of enlightenment or understanding. And I think that's a lot of times the way that Clojurists, especially those who have bought into the simple meme, think about code. Like, you must become enlightened in the ways of writing simple code. And I can help you along that path, but you must walk that path, right? It's up to you to ascend. A flip point of view, this is George Friedrich Handel. After the first performance of his amazing Messiah, which everyone in the world has heard, I'm sure, I believe it was the Duke of the town he was in congratulated him and said, like, "You have entertained the people very much tonight, congratulations." And he said, "I should be sorry if I only entertain them. I wish to make them better." And in a perfect world, that's kind of what I want my code to be like, right? If I want a library, I don't want somebody to say, "Your code saved me 3 hours today." Well, that makes me happy, but say, "I'm a better programmer because of that library you wrote." That's what matters to me, right? I want to be like this guy. Plus, he has amazing Clojure hair. So in a perfect world, you get this positive feedback loop between writing good code, writing wieldy code, to use this word that I'm going to arbitrarily latch onto, and then the code in turn makes you a better programmer whenever you read it. And I actually am going to make a fairly bold contention here that this is a quality that's unique to this word wieldy that I'm pointing out. Easy code definitely does not necessarily make me a better programmer. Easy can actually hide a lot of things, right? Generator classes in languages that do a lot of code generation, they're easy, but they hide everything that's going on. Sometimes they actively prevent you from becoming a better programmer. Simple's a lot better. Simple is all about breaking down a problem into its constituent atoms. And that's a very educational exercise. So simple does make you a better programmer when you understand simple. But wieldy, because it has to be simple and also easy, it forces you to break down a problem into its constituent parts. You need to do the same kind of deep thinking and hammock time, to use the phrase, that you do with simple codes, but you also need to build it back up again into something useful. You need to figure out, now I have all these parts, how can I compose these parts in a way that is meaningful to me, that is meaningful to other people using my library, that's a human way, that tells a story that other people can relate to. So you've had to think about the problem, building it down. You've had to think about the problem, tearing it up. And that exercise of thinking about it both ways is what makes you a better programmer, and it makes your code better in a virtuous cycle. And everyone who reads your code will get a little better, hopefully. And as you read the code of other people that are consciously attempting to do this, you will become a better programmer as well. So let's just give some quick examples of and try to pinpoint this quality a little bit more, because I haven't shown enough code. This has been far too abstract. So this is some code I would consider that is very simple, but very unwieldy, right? This is raw datomic schema. This is declaring 2 attributes in 20 lines of code, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm really glad that this underlying format exists. This is the underlying atom. Like, datomic is incredibly well designed. But at the same time, when I actually have to write a bunch of this stuff, I find myself either writing a library on top of it to generate it for me based on some simpler syntax, or doing a lot of copying and pasting. Neither of those are particularly wieldy, right? They're more work for me. And I'm not suggesting changes to this. It's an example of code that is simple, but also not necessarily the easiest thing in the world to work with. But then on the flip side, we have something that's easy, but it's actually very unwieldy. So this is this has actually been deprecated for good reason, but in Clojure's standard JDBC library, you say with connections, and it establishes a thread local binding, and then all the database operations you do inside of there use the implicit connection. Now, it's easy to do the basic thing, but it's not wieldy, because as soon as I start trying to use it for real purpose, I'm like, well, what happens if I need to connect to 2 databases at once to shovel records back and forth? Well, you can't really do that because there's only one thread local variable. What if I need the connection to cross a thread boundary? Well, now I have to do extra work to make that happen. This code is actually not wieldy. It's not usable in a large variety of contexts. It makes assumptions that I don't buy onto. It's trying so hard to be easy and just like do the simple thing and read cleanly that it neglects my need to use this in various ways, and it doesn't foresee all the stories I want to tell, right? It foresees one story it wants to tell, typing in the REPL, yeah, I made a database call, but it doesn't foresee all the situations in which I want to use it. And that's recontextualization. I'm not going to belabor this word, I promise, but this is just a concept that you can drop an idea or drop some code into a different context, and it, in essence, becomes a new thing, right? Things depend upon the context where they are. And I think in the context of programming, this simply means that other people do have code that's worth writing, and you don't know what that code is, and you can't decide how to write it for them. But if you want to help them out in their task, without even knowing what their task is, you need to write code that will work in a variety of contexts that makes as few assumptions as possible, right? This is why we don't like macros, because macros are not composable, right? Same thing with the JDBC example I just talked about. You want to write, so you don't want to make assumptions that are going to bind anyone who wants to participate in your story or extend your story to their own. They don't want you, you shouldn't try not to overfit to the specific problem. If you overfit to the problem, you've written code that's easy, but it's not simple. It's not reusable for other problems. It's not flexible. And if you underfit, if I just provide a sack of parts, then I've written maybe some simple code, but I haven't actually addressed people's needs. So it's difficult. There's a fine art there. Running out of time, so I'll really quickly go through this, but I think this also maps to documentation. So reference documentation, I would say, maps to the simple philosophy. Tutorial style document, I would say, maps to the easy philosophy. And then everyone, I haven't heard this term defined before, but something I think of as more as conceptual documentation maps to this new concept I'm trying to parse out here, wieldy. So reference style documentation is like Clojure's documentation, right? It's terse, it's complete, but it doesn't give any context for the thing you're trying to use. So yeah, it's, returns a new sorted set with supplied keys using the supplied comparator, equal keys are handled as if by repeated uses of const. Boom. Unless I know what all the words in the definition mean, I can't understand that. But it's very simple. You want this kind of documentation. Tutorial style is task-oriented. It's long form. The concepts are doled out carefully. As you need concepts, they'll teach you the concepts. Good book. Again, I'm glad tutorial style stuff exists, but it's focused on being easy. I can just sit down and turn the pages, and after I turn 100 pages and type in all the examples, I will know something new, right? Conceptual style documentation takes a problem statement and says, what is the story I'm trying to tell? Says what the problem is. Outlines the concepts that I'm going to use to solve it, right? It breaks down the problem into its parts, clearly labels all the parts, but then talks about how to use the parts. It has examples of common usages. And most good documentation does follow this. I'm not saying anything new here. And then it also has pointers to the reference documentation. I'd say, roughly one page. That's obviously that's not appropriate for all projects, but it shouldn't be 30 pages of text that I have to read to understand why I want to use your library. You should be able to explain the core conceit, the core concepts behind your library in a much shorter amount of time. So really, what you want documentation to do is tell the story. That's what's going to make the code easy for people to use. That's what's going to keep it simple. Because if it's not simple, you can't describe it in one page. You want to tell the story. You want to help other people tell stories. And you want your stories to merge, right? There's no room for ego here. If I write code, I want you to use it. It's actually one of the things I love about the programming community is our inherent desire to share and spread what we do, right? I've never met a programmer who's like, I don't want anyone else to use my code because it's mine and it's my artistic thing and nobody else should even read it. Or they can read it and admire it, but don't ever touch it or fork it or modify it. That's not how we think, right? We love to collaborate, and I think that's a really awesome part of our culture. And I think we can do more. So unfortunately, if you've been listening and following along, you've probably realized by now that I actually haven't said anything that you didn't already know. I'm just saying, be good programmers, right? That's the entire distillation of this talk. I taught a new word, which hopefully is helpful to latch some concepts onto. But be a good programmer, that's hard advice. And it was hard enough to be simple, right? And now I'm telling you, you have to be simple, but you also have to be easy, and you have to do it in such a way that makes everyone around you better. That's really hard. And I actually have no idea how to do it, or I would have talked about that instead. But I think it is really important to explicitly have that as a goal as programmers. And that's really the only thing why I'm saying what I'm saying is let's make that concept explicit. That's why it's worth introducing a new word, right? Because words help us think about things. When we write code, it's easy to think back to a word and think, does this word or does this code match this set of concepts? We can take disparate concepts that are fuzzy concepts like good code and make them concrete. And that, I think, can help us be better programmers. So yeah, consider your narrative, consider your users, do your best to write good code, but specifically code that is simple and easy, and don't ignore one or the other if you can. Thank you.